I was a neurologist at Parkridge Columbia Medical Center in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Or at least I was, until I turned in my resignation last month. For this story, you can call me Dr. Bruce Kaplan. Around the neurology wing, though, most of my colleagues just knew me as the brain guy. Over 22 years, I handled everything neurology could throw at me: strokes, tumours, seizures, head injuries, and every variety of brain damage you can imagine. But the case I'm about to share is the one that shook my entire understanding of consciousness and, in the end, drove me to walk away from the profession altogether. Parkridge Columbia isn't a small clinic. It's one of the region's largest medical centers, covering southeastern Tennessee and northern Georgia, with a dedicated neurology unit built for the toughest cases. In my time there, I consulted on countless patients trapped in persistent vegetative states, families clinging to slivers of hope, and ethical questions where the line between life and death blurred into uncertainty. The case that changed everything didn't begin with me. It started years earlier, September 17th, 1988, in Walden, Tennessee, a quiet town tucked about 15 miles northeast of Chattanooga. Officer Gary French Dockery was 35 years old and only 3 months into his police career. That Saturday evening was calm, the kind of night where the most serious call might have been a fender bender or someone complaining about loud music. At around 9:30 p.m., Gary was dispatched to a reported domestic disturbance. Nothing unusual. He'd answered plenty of those already. He pulled up to the listed address, parked, and walked to the front door. What he didn't know was that the call had been staged. Behind it was Samuel Frank Downey, a 68-year-old man who harbored a grudge against law enforcement. Neighbors had complained about his noise for months, and after repeated police visits, he was seething. Downey had placed the bogus call that night with one purpose: to lure in an officer and exact revenge. The moment Gary announced himself at the door, Downey was waiting with a loaded handgun. Without a word, without giving Gary the slightest chance to react, Downey fired point blank. The bullet struck just above Gary's left eyebrow, splintered on impact, and tore through his brain. One piece lodged in his left frontal lobe. The other traveled deeper toward the back of his skull. The devastation should have been immediately fatal. Gary collapsed on the porch, blood flowing from the wound. Neighbors who heard the shot called for help, and within minutes, backup officers and paramedics arrived. They found him unconscious, breathing in ragged gasps, his pulse faint but somehow still present. He was rushed to Erlanger Hospital in Chattanooga, where the trauma team was standing by. Dr. Robert Martinez, the neurosurgeon on duty, studied Gary's scans and saw the enormity of the problem. The frontal lobe damage was catastrophic. That part of the brain controls speech, motor function, personality, decision-making, the very essence of who someone is. Swelling, bleeding, shattered tissue. It was a nightmare scenario. Still, Martinez chose to operate. The surgery lasted 8 hours. Surgeons cleared clots, bone fragments, and about 20% of Gary's left frontal lobe. The bullet fragments were too dangerous to remove, so they left them, hoping his brain would adapt. Gary survived, but just barely. For 2 weeks, his life hung in limbo. Doctors fought to manage swelling, stabilize his breathing, and keep his brain pressure under control. But consciousness never returned. After a month in the ICU, he was moved to long-term care with the diagnosis: persistent vegetative state. His body followed sleep-wake cycles. His eyes opened, sometimes he grimaced or made a sound, but none of it suggested awareness. This was where I eventually entered the story, though not until years later. In 1992, I joined Parkridge Columbia to head the expanded neurology department. One of my duties was reviewing long-term neurological cases and offering second opinions when families sought hope. That's how Gary's file landed on my desk. By then, he had been in that state for 4 years. I pored through his records, studied his scans, and examined him at the Signal Mountain Nursing Facility. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: severe, irreversible brain damage. Yes, Gary could breathe on his own, meaning his brainstem was intact. His eyes sometimes followed movement. Once in a while, he blinked to loud noises or gripped a hand in his palm. But these actions were sporadic, inconsistent, and looked more like reflexes than intention. I'd seen it countless times. Families want to believe their loved one is still inside. They'll interpret every twitch, every blink, as communication. And Gary's family, his brother Dennis and his sons, Shane and Colt, were no different. They swore he could answer yes or no by blinking, that he was more responsive when they talked about his horses or old memories. I understood their hope, but clinically I remained unconvinced. Each of my evaluations showed the same picture: minimal reflexes, no reproducible responses. His EEG scans showed the basic rhythms of sleep and wake, but no higher activity, no evidence of conscious thought. From a neurological standpoint, his prognosis was grim but stable. Patients in vegetative states can survive for years if complications are managed, but meaningful recovery past the first year is virtually unheard of. After 4, 5, 7 years, it's all but impossible. By early 1996, Gary had been in that condition for more than 7 years. His case had become routine for me. Occasional consultations, small adjustments, support for the family, but no expectation of change. That changed suddenly on the weekend of February 10th, 11th, 1996. Gary developed pneumonia, a frequent and dangerous complication for bedridden patients. His fever spiked to 104, his breathing grew laboured, and the staff called an ambulance. He was rushed back to Parkridge Columbia, and I was called in because of my history with his case. When I examined him late that Saturday night, I could tell immediately he was in critical shape. The pneumonia was aggressive, spreading through both lungs, and the soaring fever was placing even more strain on an already damaged brain. Gary's responses were weaker than ever. He wasn't even showing the occasional eye-tracking or reflexive movements I had noted in past exams. Our pulmonologist, Dr. James Fallining, evaluated him and concluded that only urgent, intensive intervention could clear the infection and stabilize his lungs. That night, the family faced a heartbreaking choice: allow Gary to pass peacefully from pneumonia or push him through invasive treatment that might preserve his life but would never reverse his underlying neurological state. I sat with his brother Dennis, Gary's primary advocate for nearly 8 years, and we talked for a long time about the reality of his condition. Dennis was worn down, his grief obvious in every word. "Dr. Kaplan, he's been holding on so long," Dennis said quietly. "Part of me feels like we should just let him rest. But what if he's been aware this whole time? What if he knows we gave up on him?" I told him as honestly and as gently as I could, "Dennis, I've seen how dedicated you've been. But the truth is the injury is severe and permanent. The bullet fragments, the damage to his frontal lobe, the years he's been unresponsive, there is no neurological path back to meaningful recovery." "But he reacts sometimes," Dennis insisted. "He blinks when we ask. He seems to know our voices." "I understand why it feels that way," I replied. "But those movements are almost certainly reflexes, not awareness. The brain can generate them even without conscious thought." After much discussion, the family chose aggressive care. Gary was admitted to the ICU, started on IV antibiotics, and given supportive treatment to bring down his fever and ease his breathing. If he failed to improve quickly, Dr. Fallining planned to surgically drain fluid from his lungs Monday morning. By Sunday evening, February 11th, I made my usual rounds. The fever had eased slightly, down from 104 to 101, and while his breathing remained strained, he looked more stable than before. I documented in his chart, no change neurologically, still minimal reflexes, no signs of consciousness. Then, at around 4 o'clock a.m., on Monday, February the 12th, 1996, I received a phone call from the ICU nurse that shattered everything I believed about brain injury and awareness. "Dr. Kaplan, you need to come right away," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and excitement. "It's Gary Dockery! He's awake! And he's talking!" I was stunned. After more than 7 years in a vegetative state, it was neurologically impossible for Gary to suddenly wake and converse. I asked her to repeat herself. "Gary is alert," she said firmly. "He's been speaking with his sister for an hour, asking questions, responding like himself." Convinced there had to be a mistake, I drove to the Tjats hospital immediately. Perhaps he was vocalizing sounds that his family misinterpreted as words. Maybe seizure activity was producing unusual noises or movements. But when I walked into the ICU at 4:45 a.m., what I saw stopped me cold. Gary Dockery was sitting upright in his bed, eyes sharp, following people around the room with intelligence and focus. He was deep in conversation with his sister Lisa, his speech clear and fluid. When he noticed me, he looked straight at me and asked, "Are you Dr. Kaplan? Lisa says I've got pneumonia. How serious is it?" I froze. This was not the unresponsive man I had examined only hours earlier. This Gary was engaged, articulate, fully aware. I pulled a chair beside his bed. "Gary," I asked carefully, "do you know where you are?" "I'm in the hospital," he answered without hesitation. "Lisa told me I've got pneumonia, but I feel a lot better than yesterday." "Do you remember what happened to you? Do you recall why you're here?" He grew thoughtful, a faint frown forming as he tried to piece it together. "I just remember being so sick, like I've been asleep forever. But I don't know why. Lisa says it's been a long time since I was okay." Lisa stood at his side, tears streaming down her cheeks. For over 7 years she had visited him, read to him, spoken to him, clung to any sign he might hear, and now, suddenly, he wasn't just hearing her, he was responding as though he'd never left. "Gary, what's the last thing you clearly remember before getting sick?" I asked. He thought for a long moment, brow furrowed. "I remember working security at UTC, the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. 3rd shift, cold nights. That's the last thing I remember." That memory stretched back years before his police work in Walden, before the shooting that destroyed his brain, before nearly 8 years lost to silence. He had no recollection of the attack, no awareness of the long, unresponsive years that had followed. For the next several hours, I carried out the most extraordinary and baffling neurological examination of my entire career. Despite the massive brain damage I knew he carried, Gary's mind seemed shockingly intact. He could handle simple math problems, recall vivid details from his past, and hold fluent conversations on a wide range of topics. His speech was clear, properly structured, and entirely appropriate to context. His memory for life before 1988 was sharp, though everything after his injury was a complete blank. Most astonishing of all, his family said his personality hadn't changed. He was cracking jokes, calling his horses by name, and asking to see old friends. It was as if his consciousness had been paused for 7.5 years, then suddenly unpaused. But reality reminded us his brain injury was still severe. Gary was paralyzed below the chest, unable to walk or control bladder and bowel function. His fine hand movements were clumsy, though he could still grip objects and gesture as he spoke. These deficits fit perfectly with the kind of damage to his frontal lobe and motor cortex we had long known he suffered. That Monday, I contacted every neurologist I could reach. Throughout the day, Gary was examined by specialists from multiple disciplines: neurology, neurosurgery, neuropsychology, psychiatry. Each one was as stunned as I was by what they were witnessing. We rushed him through brain scans, blood panels, and every diagnostic tool available. The results only deepened the mystery. His CT and MRI were unchanged, still showing the missing tissue in his frontal lobe, the bullet fragments lodged inside, the scarring and atrophy from years of damage. Nothing suggested regrowth or repair. His blood work reflected pneumonia treatment, but nothing that could explain his sudden return to awareness. The most shocking result was his EEG. For years it had shown the slow, limited patterns typical of a vegetative state. Now it displayed the clear, structured activity of a fully conscious brain. Gary spent that entire day in conversation. Family members travelled from several states to see him. Friends called in disbelief, only to confirm for themselves that Gary's personality, memories and humour were intact. He asked detailed questions about his 2 sons, who are now 12 and 20, though he remembered them last as little boys of 5 and 12. The moment that stayed with me most was when Gary asked about time. His brother Dennis had been avoiding the truth, but Gary wouldn't let it go. "Dennis, how long have I been sick? Lisa says a few years, but it feels like longer." Dennis looked at me, then back at his brother. "Gary, it's been 7.5 years since the shooting." Gary went quiet, taking it in. Then he said softly, 7.5 years? That's a long time. No wonder I feel like I've been asleep forever. No wonder the boys are so grown." He asked about world events, about who had been president, about what he'd missed. When told that the Berlin Wall had fallen and the Soviet Union was gone, he shook his head. "Guess I missed some pretty big history." But as Monday stretched on, I noticed a shift. His speech was still coherent, but he wasn't initiating conversations as often. By evening, he could still answer questions and recognize visitors, but the energy and flow from earlier had dulled. On Tuesday, February the 13th, he spoke less frequently. He answered questions clearly when asked, but no longer volunteered detailed stories or long conversations. By Wednesday, February the 14th, his responses had narrowed further, mostly yes or no answers, short phrases instead of the lively dialogue we had heard just days earlier. He was still more aware than he had been in the previous 7 years, but it felt like he was slowly slipping back. On Thursday, February the 15th, he underwent the lung surgery Dr. Verlinning had originally scheduled. The procedure went smoothly for his pneumonia, but when he came out of anesthesia, the remarkable clarity he'd shown seemed to be gone. He was alert, but not truly engaged. When asked what time it was, he said, "Night," though it was mid-afternoon. When asked his name, sometimes he answered correctly, sometimes not at all. In the weeks and months that followed, Gary's awareness flickered. Occasionally he would give short replies to direct questions, sometimes identifying loved ones, sometimes answering simple yes or no. But the man who had spent 18 astonishing hours talking about horses, family, and memories had disappeared again, locked back inside the silence. I couldn't stop thinking about it. For months, I pored over every test, consulted colleagues across the country, and scoured the literature for cases like his. The most plausible explanation was tied to his pneumonia and the treatments that followed. Gary's soaring fever from the infection, combined with the heavy antibiotics and other medications we had administered, might have temporarily shifted his brain chemistry just enough to let long dormant pathways fire again. But when we later tried to reproduce those conditions, same drugs, same doses, same timing, nothing changed. Gary stayed locked in his limited responsive state, showing no hint of the clarity and presence we had witnessed that February. Some of the colleagues I consulted floated other theories. Maybe the shock of his near-fatal illness had jolted his brain into a temporary state of higher function, or perhaps he had been processing the conversations his family had about his care, and the looming risk of death triggered something deep within. Yet none of these ideas could fully account for why his awakening had been so complete, why his memories and humour were intact, why it lasted almost exactly 18 hours, or why, despite every attempt, he faded back again. The case quickly drew national and even international attention. Reporters dubbed him the miracle cop and the coma patient who woke up. Medical journals published detailed reports. Neurologists, surgeons, and consciousness researchers reached out from around the world to discuss what his case might mean for our understanding of the brain and its hidden reserves. And still, for all the theories and headlines, Gary's brief return to full awareness remained a mystery. The part that haunted me most wasn't just the strangeness of his recovery, it was what it implied about the years that had come before. If he could wake up and instantly hold conversations, recognize loved ones, recall names, and even tell jokes, how much had he been perceiving during those 7.5 silent years? I thought back to moments his family had insisted he was aware, when they swore he blinked to questions, when they said he seemed to track voices or follow movement in the room. Had they been right all along? The possibility that Gary had been trapped in his own body, conscious but unable to show it, for nearly 8 years was deeply unsettling. His family came to believe with certainty that he had heard them the whole time. The updates, the stories, the prayers, every word of love whispered at his bedside. They believed his awakening was his way of proving it, a final message that he had been there with them, listening, present, even when he couldn't respond. As a doctor, I wanted to dismiss that as wishful thinking, but the evidence of his preserved personality, his intact memories, his natural emotional reactions, it was almost impossible to argue he had simply switched on after years of total nothingness. Gary Dockery passed away on April 15, 1997, 13 months after those extraordinary 18 hours of clarity. The cause was a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in his lungs, a tragically common and often fatal risk for patients who are immobilized for years. His passing wasn't unexpected, but it closed one of the most baffling and haunting chapters in the medical study of consciousness and coma. In the months following his fleeting return to consciousness and before his eventual passing, Gary sometimes managed to speak a single word or a short phrase when prompted. But he never again experienced the kind of complete, sustained awareness he had shown during those 18 remarkable hours in February of 1996. It was as if he had been granted a short escape from his neurological prison, just long enough to reconnect with his family to assure them he was still there, before slipping back into the unresponsive state that would define the remainder of his life. Gary's case completely reshaped the way I practiced neurology. I grew far more hesitant to declare any patient as permanently unconscious or without the possibility of meaningful recovery. I became more attentive when families insisted that their loved ones were showing faint signs of awareness that our clinical tools failed to capture. His story also drove me deeper into the study of consciousness, persistent vegetative states, and new diagnostic methods designed to uncover traces of awareness in patients we once assumed had none. What Gary taught us was that our knowledge of the brain and of consciousness itself is still incomplete, and that people who appear entirely unaware may in fact be experiencing far more than we can perceive. But his case didn't just change my medical approach, it left a lasting mark on me as a person. For months after his death, I would lie awake at night replaying what I had witnessed. If Gary had been aware throughout those 7 silent years, what must that have felt like? Was he frustrated at his inability to respond? Did he hear every conversation, every decision about his care, every word spoken at his bedside? The idea of being mentally present yet physically trapped for years on end was almost too terrifying to consider. Afterward, I questioned nearly every encounter with patients labelled as vegetative. During evaluations, I caught myself wondering, are they hearing this? Do they know what I'm saying about them? Are they silently listening as families wrestle with choices that may decide their fate? These doubts began to erode my ability to function as a neurologist. I lingered with patients longer than before, searching for subtle clues of awareness, and I found it harder to give families the clear, definitive answers they needed. 6 months after Gary's death, I was asked to consult on another case, a young woman who had been in a vegetative state for 3 years after a car crash. As I explained to her family that her condition was permanent and her awareness non-existent, I noticed a tear run down her cheek. Her relatives swore that she often cried when they discussed painful topics, and that her facial expressions changed with different conversations. I had always dismissed these as reflexes, but after Gary, I couldn't shake the thought, what if I was wrong? What if she was listening to every word? I finished that consultation, but inside I knew I couldn't go on like this. How could I confidently tell families their loved ones were unconscious when I had seen the impossible happen once before? Within 3 weeks, I handed in my resignation at Columbia Parkridge Medical Center. Officially, I claimed I was pursuing new opportunities. In reality, Gary Dockery's case had shattered my certainty about everything I thought I knew regarding the brain, awareness, and human consciousness. I relocated to a smaller town, opening a general practice focused on everyday medicine, blood pressure, diabetes, preventive care, areas with clear tests and proven treatments. I deliberately avoided anything involving neurology, brain trauma, or disorders of consciousness. Yet Gary never left my thoughts. I kept up with every new development in brain imaging and consciousness research, hopeful that technology like functional MRI might finally help detect awareness in patients who seemed unreachable. In medical literature, Gary Dockery's case remains one of the best documented and most closely studied examples of unexpected recovery from a vegetative state. It continues to be cited in journals, discussed at conferences, and debated in ethical arguments about brain injury and end-of-life decisions. But for me, it represents something much deeper. It's a constant reminder of medicine's limits and the profound mysteries still hidden within human consciousness. By every measure we have, Gary should never have woken up. His injuries were too severe, his years of unresponsiveness too long, his scans too unchanged. Yet he did awaken, and for 18 extraordinary hours, he was completely himself. Cognitively intact, full of memory, personality, and love. It was a medical impossibility that shook everything we thought we knew, and it continues to challenge us even today. The greatest lesson from Gary's story may not be medical at all, but human. It reminds us that those we call vegetative or unconscious may be far more present than we realize. It suggests that awareness might persist in ways beyond our current ability to measure. For his family, those 18 hours were the gift of knowing he had been there all along, listening, understanding, loving, when he couldn't show it. It gave them the chance to say goodbye, to speak their love, and to hear his final reassurance. For the medical community, his case is a powerful argument for humility, for treating every brain-injured patient as if some spark of awareness may remain. It shows us that the border between consciousness and unconsciousness is far more fragile and mysterious than we once believed. For me, Gary Dockery's awakening will always stand as the most humbling, unexplained experience of my career. It forced me to accept that medicine, for all its progress, still cannot fully grasp the mysteries of life, awareness, and what it truly means to wake up.